Welcome back, or welcome if you haven't been here before. My name is Jacoby. I'm from the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art. And I welcome everyone. I don't know who's been here actually this in the afternoon. Oh, okay, so this is quite mixed. Okay, in that case, I'd like to welcome everyone here. I also like to thank the Architecture Foundation, Alice Woodman and John Asbury from the Barbican for hosting us tonight. And as I explained earlier, the event tonight is part of a project called Housing Standardization, the architecture of regulations and building standards. Design standards. I never use the subtitles, so I'm sorry, I always forget. And as part of this, it's a project that we've been running for about two and a half years, and we are just about to wrap up. And the project was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and supported by the Prose Philosophy Foundation. What I will do is I'll kick off the event this evening by talking a little bit about the work we've done to both sort of, I think, share some of our key findings, even though this is kind of work in progress still, but also maybe to provide a context of the work that's much more, or the discussion that's hopefully much more comparative. I think in particular I will focus on two issues. One is around housing affordability, and the other one is housing design in the international context, which of course relates them back to our invited speakers who have participated in our study. So according to the Royal Institute of British Architects, only 6% of housing in the UK is designed by architects. Unsurprisingly, less than a third of the UK's 25 biggest house builders employ their own architects. This means that most housing is extensively standardized in its design and traditional in construction. In our study of recently completed mixed housing developments marketed in England in 2022, the 4,064 two-bed and three-bed houses analyzed were based on only 129 standard house types. And in this example, as you can see here, the basic plan is varied according to tenure and local planning or client requirements. Worthwhile to note is the range of dwelling sizes, with the largest just meeting the nationally described space standard of 79 square meters, and the lower just above the housing quality indicator previously used in affordable housing programs. You can see that private homes are generally slightly smaller and have a wider plan due to an ensuite to the master bedroom. This example also highlights that the majority of affordable housing today is a byproduct of private developments created through planning applications and therefore provided by the same developer. As an audit by the Place Alliance found, the design of 3/4 of 142 large-scale housing developments completed in England from 2014 to 2019 were mediocre or poor, and over 1 in 5 developments should not have been given planning permission. Much housing in England is the outcome of economic decisions and established practices and preferences by few large organizations, with the 10 biggest volume house builders responsible for 59% of new private homes in Britain. This limits diversity in housing supply and design. Our project is therefore interested in the role of standardization and design governance in shaping housing outcomes and experiences. This is essential to understanding how design quality is defined and controlled, but also how it ultimately affects everyday life. By design governance, I mean the formal and informal tools employed by the government and housing providers or stakeholders to control the quality and types of housing being supplied. As categorized by Matthew Carmona, design governance encompasses 3 key functions: guidance, incentive, and control. Our focus is on subsidized housing, increasingly referred to as affordable housing, which is typically designed to just meet the minimum legal and market requirements and characterized by standardization. Subsidized housing is where design regulations arguably matter most, and subsidies are commonly conditional to meeting minimum standards. So-called affordable housing is, however, often not affordable to many low-income households. In 2021, only 12% of affordable housing was for social rent. The average affordable rent in England of £136.29 per week equates to 46% of the median annual household income of the poorest fifth in the UK. The majority, 54%, is for affordable and intermediate rent homes, which can be up to 80% of local market rents, and in less affordable areas exceeds the median national income. And of course, as you might know, shared ownership is targeted at mid-income households. With social rented housing arguably the most affordable provision for low-income households, assuming a proportional spend, in England just around 5% or £2 million of government investment currently supports it, with the vast majority of investment going towards the private sector and home ownership, which of course makes up a large portion of affordable housing. With each social rented home now costing about £400,000 to build in London, this would pay outright for 5 social rent homes. Yet, according to the National Housing Federation, there is a need for 1.6 million additional social rent homes in England alone. At the same time, government subsidizes private landlords to the tune of £70 billion in the same period. Considering the extensive subsidies and policy interventions in favor of the private sector, it is apparent that the rhetoric of housing neoliberalization is overly simplistic and disguises a fundamental problem in our dualistic understanding of market and non-market housing systems. A key issue of regulatory cultures prioritizing market self-regulation is that housing systems have greater sectoral differences in dwelling size and housing quality. It also leads to a stigmatization and residualization of social housing, reducing it to the function as a safety net. Across the countries we studied, there are significant differences in subsidized affordable housing delivery and affordability. It is interesting to note that Chile's neoliberal government subsidizes almost 35% of new housing, and that in China, the affordable housing supply by the government in large cities is to exceed that of market housing in the current 14th, 50-year period for the first time. With Guangzhou, for example, provisions including 92% or 600,000 new public rental homes, acknowledging a failure of ownership-based models and a need for long-term public housing assets with rent control. I should also add that even in the UK, the national space standards apply theoretically for the first time to all new housing, recognizing the need to address regional and sectoral differences. Many countries use standard design solutions, mandatory regulations, and voluntary good practice guides and standards to control housing design. These design regulations include technical housing standards that control various aspects essential to decent housing, such as space provision, amenities, functionality, health and safety, structural performance, and environmental comfort. Space standards have become a key measure of housing quality based on 2 fundamental beliefs still largely upheld. First, a socio-spatial belief harking back to 19th century Victorian charitable housing trusts that improving the housing and life of the lower classes means improving their moral behavior and social conduct. Second, a socio-technical belief that socio-spatial relations can be mapped, measured, and improved, as first demonstrated by Charles Booth's social cartography. Space standards instrumentalize these beliefs by translating normative daily domestic activities and spatial hierarchies based on social norms, specifically the nuclear family, into graphical, anthropometric data, standardized furniture dimensions and activity zones, and circulation space required by the various expected uses of a home. This principle of abstracting home use, function, and social norm into a drawing with dimensions has become a pseudoscientific proof of good design and conventionalized by design handbooks such as Ernst Neufeld's Architect's Data and the widely adopted use of minimum space standards. A key problem of minimum space standards is, however, that rather than being aspirational, they often become the targeted maximum dwelling size that does not necessarily ensure usability, as we all know from COVID-19. Despite a long history of space standards since 1918 in England, properties are marketed and described in relation to the number of bedrooms, not overall floor areas or cost per square meter, with many homeowners and renters therefore not knowing how big the properties are. At the same time, the small size of homes in England is frequently discussed in the media. We therefore studied dwelling sizes in London, and as the housing stock is very old, with 56% built before the end of World War II, and many properties having been substantially changed over time, we found that 61% of dwellings failed the space standards of the 2010 London Housing Design Guide, which is fairly translated into the current national described space standards. In fact, 88% of properties failed at least one of the minimum recommended dimensions in the London Housing Design Guide. However, since the introduction of the guide, the overall failure rate has dropped to 33%. We subsequently studied the space standards of new affordable homes in England. The current nationally described space standards, however, are not mandatory, and only 36% of local planning authorities have adopted them. We found that 43% of the dwellings we looked at failed the space standards. Now, to answer the question if space standards work, the simple answer is yes, if comparing outcomes between councils that have or have not adopted space standards. But it is more complicated. As this table shows, the overall compliance rate in local authorities that adopted the space standards is 69%. However, less than half of all houses meet the NDSS, as they can provide the expected room sizes without achieving the overall space standards. There are significant differences in regions and between housing provider, yet even where homes do not meet the current NDSS, they are designed to some standards, such as the HQI, as the data shows here. Right? Standards have been in use before. Even room standards and required activity zones that we would assume to be more objective can differ significantly, indicating various furniture standards and cultural expectations. For example, the minimum size of a double bedroom ranges from 9 square meters in France to 12 square meters in Scotland. In Australia, a minimum 19 centimeter wide movement area next to the bed is required, whereas in the London Housing Design Guide, it is only 40 centimeters. These differences are only partially explained by housing provider tenure or target group, especially in countries with universal design controls that equally apply to all sectors and often reflect different economic development and sociocultural norms, resulting in vastly different dwelling sizes and housing expectations. This is also evident from how housing standards and quality are determined or controlled in different countries. And the dwelling size is prescribed. For instance, the standard unit size for a two-person dwelling is 14 to 22 square meters in Hong Kong, 28 square meters in France, 49 square meters in Canada, and 55 to 65 square meters in Australia. With housing in England, the Netherlands, and Chile delivered by large volume house builders, highly standardized layouts are common, whereas in Barcelona and Zurich, where developments are typically based on design competitions, there's much greater variation. In the countries discussed tonight, housing in Zurich is noticeably larger than in England. Homes in Santiago, much smaller, and in the Netherlands and Spain, they're slightly smaller than the ones in the UK. To put this into context, we have seen increases in space standards in England over time. For example, with the NDSS, about 10% larger than the Parker Morris standards from the 1960s that's still often quoted today. A European-wide comparison 2010 of square meter per person shows that England is only behind Denmark, Luxembourg, and Sweden, even before space standards were reintroduced in London and then subsequently nationally, with comparative dwelling sizes since having significantly changed, as you can see from this. Although England's homes were smaller in 2010 than in most other EU states, when comparing like for like, there is extensive underoccupation and a preference for homes with more bedrooms, and, importantly, an inequitable distribution of floor area per person, especially in the private rented sector. Floor areas, therefore, provide only a limited understanding of home use and lived experience. Studying housing expectations and actual use is equally important. For example, in England, especially in social rented homes and in Chile, the room sizes are hierarchical, with secondary bedrooms often designed to fit just a single bed, a small desk, and perhaps a small wardrobe, assuming the needs of a family. In contrast, in Zurich and Barcelona, more rooms tend to be designed to fit a double bed, offering greater flexibility. There are also cultural differences in the expected services or amenities found in a home. In Zurich, communal washing machines are common. In England, new-built homes now provide a standard utility cupboard that can house a washing machine, but they are still often part of the kitchen. There's also no designated space for drying clothes. Whereas in Chile, a ventilated loggia next to the kitchen for washing and drying clothes is the norm, despite overall very small dwelling sizes. Similarly, there are differences in the finishes of fittings expected. For example, kitchens in Zurich come fully fitted with all appliances and cupboards. In Barcelona, kitchens are only equipped for basic use, with residents often upgrading them. In Santiago, the kitchen provision is just a sink, and all kitchens are part of an open-plan living area, which is too small to use the dining table without moving it for every meal. In England, kitchen provisions depend on a housing provider and tenure. One participant mentioned to us that their home came only with a stove. We therefore studied how people furnish and use their homes, as this is typically very different from what is drawn by architects, to gain insights into the discrepancies between the assumptions about dwelling use that underpin space standards in everyday life at home. As part of this, we have used live motion tracking of occupants to understand the patterns of use, with occupants often surprised by how their use of homes differs from how they thought they were. When we asked in a survey with over 1,200 respondents from London what they liked or disliked about the homes, the responses were surprisingly more balanced than expected, indicating the difficulty in generalizing housing problems, uses, or needs. The most problematic homes suffered not always from the most obvious large problems, but an accumulation of what might seem minor problems, often hidden in small percentages. Also, what people meant by design was very interesting. When interviewing some survey respondents, they spoke about how comparison with TV shows, friends and family, or the place they grew up in shaped their perception of housing. There's a great discrepancy, therefore, between what designers, regulators, and occupants mean by housing standards and housing quality. The agency to make change to the homes was seen by many as essential to well-being and positive lived experience. From our interviews with occupants of affordable homes in different countries, it is apparent that there are vast differences, but also significant small nuances in housing experiences that are important to understand. The generalized and standardized approach to regulation and design tends to be most problematic to those in greatest needs of protection and support. Therefore, future housing standards and design needs to take greater account of lived experiences and social expectations and value that shape socio-spatial realities and housing perceptions. Thank you.